There was nothing unusual about the invitation at first. Cream-colored card, elegant lettering, gold trim, the kind of invitation that would look perfectly at home among Britain's wealthiest families. But then someone noticed the symbol above Laura Lopes' name, a crown, and suddenly, a private family gathering appeared to carry something much more powerful, the appearance of royal approval. That tiny detail would become the center of a much larger question. Who had authorized it? Laura Lopes is no stranger to the world of art. She is Queen Camilla's daughter and has worked in the art world for years. In 2026, she has continued to appear publicly with her mother, including at Royal Ascot, where she was seen alongside Camilla and other members of the royal family, town and country. But the story we are examining takes that real family connection and imagines a very different kind of royal controversy. According to the scenario, Laura was preparing a private art reception connected to Windsor. Nothing about a private art event would normally be enough to cause a palace crisis. The problem was the way the event appeared to be presented. A royal symbol had suddenly appeared on the invitation, and underneath Laura's name were words suggesting a level of approval that had not been publicly established. That raised an uncomfortable possibility. Was someone simply trying to make the invitation look more prestigious, or was someone deliberately creating the impression that the monarchy itself was behind the event? Those are two very different things, and inside a royal institution, the difference matters. Because a family connection does not automatically equal royal authority. That distinction becomes even more important when the guest list begins to attract attention. The names reportedly included wealthy art patrons, gallery figures, and influential people whose presence could give the event considerably more weight than an ordinary private gathering. Then another name appeared, a property lawyer. At first glance, that might not mean anything. People attending art events often have lawyers. But this particular detail becomes important because the story also involves valuable artwork and questions about ownership, and that is where the mystery begins to deepen. Because one painting was allegedly expected to appear at the event, not an ordinary painting. A piece supposedly connected to the royal collection. If that description were accurate, the situation would immediately become much more serious. Royal artwork is not simply personal property that can be moved around whenever a family member wants to display it. There are questions of ownership, custody, insurance, security, and documentation. So if a valuable royal associated painting suddenly appeared at a private gathering without clear authorization, somebody would have some explaining to do. And then came the detail that changed everything. A document was reportedly presented as proof that the event had authority to continue, but the source of that authorization was unclear. No one seemed willing to take responsibility for it, and that created the first real mystery. Who had given the permission? Was it someone inside the Queen's household? Was it someone acting independently? Or had someone simply used the royal name to make a private plan look official? For Prince William, the issue would not simply be about one invitation. It would be about the boundary between family influence and institutional authority, and that boundary was about to be tested, because the more closely the documents were examined, the stranger the story became. There was the invitation, there was the unexplained authorization, there was the lawyer, and then there was the painting, 4 separate pieces of a puzzle that did not seem to belong together, until one possibility began to emerge. Maybe the invitation was never the real story. Maybe it was only the first clue, because somewhere inside the paperwork surrounding the event was supposedly a much larger plan. A plan that could involve royal residences, private cultural events, wealthy patrons, and a future role for Camilla's family that had never been publicly announced. And if that plan really existed, one question suddenly became unavoidable. Who had been building it behind the scenes, and why had nobody told Prince William? That is where the story takes its first serious turn. The question was no longer whether the event looked royal. The question was whether someone had deliberately made it look royal. And that distinction mattered. Because if the crown on the invitation was unauthorized, then somebody had crossed a line that the palace takes seriously. But there was something even more troubling. The paperwork surrounding the event did not appear to match the story being presented to the guests. One document suggested the reception was simply a private family gathering. Another appeared to give it a much more official character. And somewhere between those two versions was a missing piece, an authorization. In this fictionalized scenario, palace staff began trying to determine where that document had come from. The answer seemed simple at first. It appeared to have originated somewhere within the Queen's household. But that created another problem. A member of Camilla's household could not simply create royal authority that did not exist. And if someone had done exactly that, the question became much more serious. Who had given them the confidence to do it? The mystery deepened when staff discovered that the event preparations had gone further than expected. Decorations were already being arranged. Artwork was being prepared for display, and people connected to the event appeared to believe everything had been approved. That suggested one of two possibilities. Either someone had completely misunderstood the limits of their authority, or someone had deliberately allowed other people to believe that the palace had approved something it had not. For William, the distinction would be crucial. Because the monarchy depends heavily on one thing that outsiders rarely see: clear lines of authority. A family member can have access to the royal family without having the authority of the crown. A private invitation can mention a royal connection without becoming an official royal invitation. And a painting associated with a royal household does not automatically become the private property of whoever happens to display it. But then came the discovery that made the entire situation more complicated. A painting prepared for the reception allegedly carried a label suggesting it belonged to a private royal collection. That phrase immediately raised questions. Who owned it? Who had authorized its movement? Who had insured it? And why was it being displayed at this particular event? The answers were not immediately clear, and that was when attention turned toward the property lawyer on the guest list. Because lawyers who specialize in trusts and valuable assets don't usually become central characters in a simple family art reception. At least, not unless something more complicated is happening behind the scenes. The lawyer's presence suddenly looked less like a coincidence, and then another document appeared. It suggested that the artwork might eventually be connected to a private family arrangement. That changed the stakes completely. Because now the story wasn't simply about an invitation, it was about ownership, and ownership inside a royal family can become extraordinarily complicated. Personal gifts, official property, private collections, trusts, inherited assets, publicly held objects. All of these categories can have very different legal implications, so imagine the tension when a painting appears to sit somewhere between those categories. One person believes it is a personal gift, another believes it remains protected by a formal arrangement, and everyone else is left trying to determine which version is actually true. That is where William's position becomes more understandable within the fictional scenario. He would not necessarily need to believe that Laura herself had created the problem. He would only need to believe that someone had used her name to move something they were not authorized to move, and that possibility would explain why the invitation suddenly mattered so much. Because the crown on the card may have been more than decoration. It may have been an attempt to create an appearance of legitimacy before the event even began, and if wealthy guests arrived believing they were attending something officially connected to the monarchy, that appearance could become difficult to undo. But then came the question nobody seemed prepared to answer. Who approved the plan in the first place? Laura's side appeared to believe they had permission. Camilla's household appeared to be connected to the paperwork, and yet the official palace position seemed completely different. Somewhere between those three versions was the truth. Then, just when it seemed the investigation was focused entirely on Laura, another name surfaced, a senior advisor connected to Camilla's household, and suddenly, the story took an entirely different direction. Because the evidence suggested that Laura may not have been the person driving the plan at all. She may have simply been the person whose name made the plan possible. And if that was true, then the most important question was no longer, what was Laura trying to do? It was, who was trying to do it through Laura? That question would soon lead directly back to the Queen's household, and eventually, to King Charles himself. The discovery of the advisor changed the direction of the investigation. Until that moment, it was possible to imagine that Laura had simply misunderstood what she had been told. But now there was another possibility. Someone inside the Queen's circle may have been actively helping the event move forward, and that raised a far more uncomfortable question. What exactly were they trying to accomplish? The answer seemed to be sitting in the East Terrace room. Behind a partially dismantled display wall was the painting that had attracted so much attention. It was not listed clearly among the ordinary pieces prepared for the reception. Its paperwork was incomplete, and its ownership was suddenly being questioned. For a moment, The room became almost silent, because if the painting really belonged to a protected royal collection, moving it without proper authorization could be a serious matter. But if it had been privately gifted to Camilla years earlier, the situation would be completely different. Two possibilities, two completely different outcomes, and nobody seemed able to produce the document that would settle the argument. That was when Laura allegedly offered an explanation. She believed the painting had been given to her mother privately. The gift, she suggested, had happened years earlier. There was just one problem. There was no formal transfer document immediately available to support the claim. Instead, there was something much more personal, a handwritten note, a birthday message. Nothing that looked like a legal contract. But at the bottom of the page was a sentence that could easily be interpreted in more than one way, a promise that one day the painting would belong to Camilla, and suddenly an emotional family gesture had become a potential question of ownership. Was Charles describing a future gift? Was he simply expressing affection, or had everyone involved interpreted the same words differently? That distinction could change everything, because in a family as closely watched as the Windsors, private promises and formal legal arrangements are not necessarily the same thing. And this was where the property lawyer's presence suddenly made sense. If there really was a disagreement over ownership, legal advice would become essential, but William still wasn't satisfied. The painting was only one part of the mystery. He wanted to know who had authorized the event itself. More specifically, he wanted to see the document that had apparently allowed the reception to continue after palace concerns had already been raised, but the document was nowhere to be found. That was perhaps the strangest part of the entire situation. People remembered seeing it. Someone had reportedly read it. Someone had used it to justify moving forward, yet when investigators tried to locate it, it had disappeared. And now the story had changed from a disagreement over an invitation into something much more serious. A missing document, a disputed painting, an unexplained royal symbol, and a group of influential guests who may have believed they were attending an event with royal approval. Then came another discovery. Inside a folder connected to the event was a proposal for a much larger cultural program. The idea was reportedly centered around private cultural gatherings involving members of Camilla's wider family and influential patrons. If authentic, the proposal would have been much bigger than one evening of art. It would have represented an attempt to create a continuing network around the Queen's family. And that explained something that had previously seemed insignificant: the crown, the royal styling, the carefully selected guests, the appearance of official approval. Suddenly, those details could be interpreted as part of a larger branding strategy. But there was still one person whose position had not been fully explained: King Charles. Had he known about the event? Had he approved any part of the plan? Or had people simply assumed that because the event was connected to his wife, it somehow carried his authority? That question was about to become impossible to avoid. Because according to this fictionalized scenario, Charles was finally brought into the discussion, and when he saw the painting, his reaction reportedly changed the entire atmosphere. He recognized it, but recognition was not the same as approval. William asked the question that everyone else had been avoiding. Had Charles actually given the painting to Camilla? The room waited, and the answer was not what anyone expected. Charles denied that he had formally transferred ownership. Suddenly, every assumption made during the planning of the event was in question. Camilla's family believed one thing, the palace believed another, and the documents seemed to tell a third story. But there was still one final piece missing: the person who had created the questionable authorization. Because until that person was identified, nobody could know whether this entire situation had been caused by a misunderstanding or by someone deliberately pushing the boundaries of royal authority. And that answer was about to surface, not from Laura, not from Camilla, not even from Charles, but from someone working quietly inside the Queen's own circle. The investigation had reached a point where every explanation seemed to create another question. If Laura believed the event had been approved, who had convinced her? If Camilla's household was involved, who had authorized the paperwork? And if the painting was never formally transferred, why had anyone been confident enough to display it? There was only one way to answer those questions: find the person who created the authorization. According to this fictionalized scenario, palace staff eventually traced the questionable document back to a senior advisor working within Camilla's private household. That discovery changed the entire atmosphere, because this was no longer simply a disagreement between members of a family. Someone with access to royal systems had apparently taken steps to make a private event appear more officially connected to the crown than it really was, and the advisor had an explanation. She claimed she had not been trying to undermine William, she had been trying to protect Camilla. Her fear, according to the scenario, was that Camilla's family would gradually lose its place around the royal institution as the next generation became more prominent. In her mind, creating a stronger cultural network around Camilla's family could give them influence that would survive changes within the monarchy. But that explanation created an even bigger problem, because protecting someone's position does not give an advisor the right to invent royal authority. And using royal symbols without permission could make a private project appear to have the backing of the monarchy. That was exactly the line the palace could not afford to blur. The advisor reportedly admitted to helping prepare the proposal. She also accepted responsibility for the disputed invitations and the language that made the event appear more official. But she insisted that Laura had not understood the full picture. Laura, in this version of events, had been told that everything was already approved. And that changed how William viewed her role. Instead of seeing Laura as the mastermind, he could now see her as someone who had relied on information coming from people she trusted. But one problem remained. Laura had received the warning that the event should not proceed, and she had continued anyway. That meant responsibility could not simply disappear. Even if she had been misled, she had still acted on information that had not been properly verified. And that was when the conflict became personal. Camilla reportedly felt that her daughter was being treated as though she had deliberately attempted to break palace rules. William saw it differently. From his perspective, the issue was not Laura's family connection. It was the use of royal authority without clear permission. The argument between them therefore became less about one painting and more about something much larger. Who gets to decide where family privilege ends and royal authority begins? Camilla believed the situation had been handled too aggressively. William believed the palace had been too lenient for too long. And Charles was caught directly between them. Then came the final discovery. A guest list. 42 names. Most appeared to have been added during the normal planning process, but one name had been written onto the list separately. The handwriting was not Laura's, it was not the advisor's, and according to the scenario, Charles recognized it immediately, because it was his own handwriting. That changed everything. If Charles had added the name weeks earlier, then he had known about the event before the controversy exploded. Maybe he had never approved the questionable invitation. Maybe he had never authorized the painting to be displayed. But he had known enough about the gathering to have some involvement. And suddenly William faced an uncomfortable realization. The palace crisis may not have started because someone deliberately challenged the crown. It may have started because nobody had clearly defined the limits in the first place. Charles had wanted family harmony. Camilla had wanted her children to remain close. Laura had trusted the people around her. An advisor had tried to protect Camilla's position, and William had stepped in when he believed royal authority was being blurred. Every person involved had a different understanding of the same situation. But there was still one question hanging over the room. What would Charles do now that he knew exactly how far the situation had gone? Because whatever decision he made next would determine whether this remained a private family disagreement, or became a permanent warning for everyone connected to the monarchy. Charles had listened long enough. The invitation was on the table, the disputed documents were beside it, and the painting that had started the entire argument was no longer in the room. For several moments nobody spoke, because everyone understood what was at stake. This was no longer about an art reception, it was about whether personal relationships could quietly turn into royal authority. William wanted clear boundaries. Camilla wanted her daughter protected. Laura wanted the situation understood from her perspective, and the advisor had already admitted that she had taken matters further than she should have. Charles now had to decide what happened next. According to this fictionalized scenario, he chose neither a dramatic public confrontation nor a family punishment. Instead, He established a rule, a simple rule, but one that could prevent the same confusion from happening again. No private member of the family could act with royal authority unless that authority had been formally granted. No invitation could imply official endorsement without approval. No royal symbol could be used simply because someone had a connection to the family. And no artwork connected to the crown could be moved without proper documentation. It sounded straightforward, but for William, the decision came too late. Because he believed the entire situation had exposed something deeper. The monarchy was entering a period in which family relationships and institutional responsibilities would increasingly overlap, and when those two worlds became blurred, even a private decision could create a much bigger problem. Camilla did not see it that way. She believed her daughter had been placed under unnecessary suspicion. To her, Laura had not attempted to seize royal power. She had trusted the wrong people. William disagreed with the way the situation had unfolded, but he also understood that trust had played a major role. And then came the most uncomfortable moment of all. William reportedly told Charles that the crisis could have been avoided if the boundaries had been made clear from the beginning. Charles did not immediately answer, because there was some truth in the criticism. He had tried to keep the peace between different parts of his family. He had allowed personal relationships to remain personal, but when those relationships became connected to official spaces, royal symbols, valuable property, and wealthy patrons, the distinction became impossible to ignore. A private promise could be interpreted as a legal commitment. A family invitation could be mistaken for official approval. A relative's access could be confused with institutional authority. And a simple attempt to help someone could eventually create a much larger dispute. The advisor was removed from the situation. The event did not go ahead as originally planned, and the disputed artwork was secured until its ownership could be properly established. But the most important consequence was not the cancelled reception, it was the lesson left behind, because the real danger was never the crown printed on a piece of paper. It was what that crown represented: authority, access, influence, and the assumption that one could borrow the prestige of the monarchy without accepting the responsibilities that come with it. And yet, there was still one final question. If Charles had known about the event before the controversy erupted, why hadn't he stopped it sooner? That question has no simple answer within this fictionalized scenario. Perhaps he believed the gathering was harmless. Perhaps he trusted the people organizing it. Perhaps he underestimated how quickly a private family event could become something that looked officially royal. Or perhaps he simply believed that everyone involved understood the boundaries. They didn't. And that misunderstanding was enough to create an extraordinary chain of events. The invitation disappeared. The painting was removed. The controversial proposal was abandoned. And the family moved on, at least publicly. But the deeper question remained. When you are dealing with a monarchy, where does family end and royal authority begin? Because that line may look invisible from the outside. Inside the palace, however, it can be the most important line of all. And if this fictionalized scenario teaches us anything, it is that sometimes the most dangerous royal controversies do not begin with rebellion. They begin with someone assuming they already have permission,